Sit back and listen to this extremely interesting story.
Let's hear the story. Let's listen to the man who pretended to be an idiot. In fact, he showed a very different side of himself. Dorian was standing in a long check-in line at the airport. He stood in the long check-in line at the airport. He was looking at the handsome profile of a man. He looked at the man's handsome profile. The profile is more beautiful than the front view. More beautiful than the front. I loved her. I'd been looking for her for a long time. She was worth the wait with her boyish hairstyles, her chiseled features. What's so funny without turning your head, it's all right. Her long, muscular legs, I looked at them with pride. Their relationship had its ups and downs. Dorian was a complicated man, with moral standards as high as his. Salem was the only woman like that. She was a complex person. She was an uncompromising vegetarian, minimalist, and environmental enthusiast and shelter volunteer. If they hadn't met, she probably would have stayed single for a long time. I would have stayed single for a long time, too. They were introduced by a mutual friend, Betty, 2 years ago. Salem and Betty worked in the legal department of a large advertising agency. Betty had worked in the legal department of a large advertising agency for the past 10 years. During those 10 years, Betty met Dorian for the first time. I went on a date with Dorian. I was instantly smitten. Betty and Dorian, because of their uncompromising nature, only made their relationship worse. The continuation of their relationship was almost impossible for their relationship. However, in the end, the two remained good friends. Betty introduced Dorian to her best friend because he was her best friend. Salem, they weren't the perfect couple. Dorian was not a vegetarian, just a vegetarian. He belonged to the right and she belonged to the left. Dorian belonged to the right and she belonged to the left. She loved cats. She didn't love her ginger cat. She preferred to spend time alone and preferred parties and gatherings with socializing. However, they both had one thing in common, commonalities between them, and they quickly fell in love. 10 months after their first date, they were married anniversary. A month ago, she stopped using contraceptives. Dorian worked for a large security company. Dorian worked as a department manager for a large security company. Everything he did for his country was kept secret. Whatever he did for his country, he did it well. He retired from the army at the age of 27. He suffered a lot of losses. He couldn't help but suffer losses and make connections to civilian life. He was happy to help with the transition to civilian life. From time to time, he was called to active reserve duty. Sometimes he was called up as a reserve officer. 3 or 4 times a year he was called up unexpectedly. It didn't last long, just a few days. Family never heard anything about it. Salem's upcoming trip is work-related and annual. Once a year, her company offers a 4-day, 3-night vacation at the all-inclusive resort, employees and their spouses, as well as 24 hours of free alcohol. There were daytime and nighttime parties, stand-up shows with DJ. There were excursions and special attractions. The company management spared no expense. Dorian smiled adoringly at Salem. The smile disappeared when his cell phone rang. A message popped up on the screen. "Don't answer it," he shouted hysterically. He shook his head in fear. He put the phone to his ear. "Yes, I understand," he said into the receiver. "I'm really sorry. I have to go now." "Have fun for both of us." He was mortified. He walked out of the terminal with a wistful look. A gentle hand lay on her shoulder. It was Betty's. "We're going to have the best time of our lives. I promised my best friend." The flight and ride to the resort was relatively comfortable. The flight to the resort was relatively short. Check-in went smoothly. Betty and her roommate, Lisa, weren't that far from their hotel room. Breathtaking. The breathtaking deep blue bay was visible from the room's balcony. The resort rooms were scattered around the hillside. The resort rooms were arranged in rows on the hillside that sloped down to the beach. Bars, clubs, and sports facilities were also located here. Location. Fortunately for Betty and Salem, their row was not located on a hill. Otherwise, after they had showered and changed their clothes, had lunch in the dining room, went to the bar. When I went back to Betty and Lisa's room, Oscar and Ben, young copywriters living next door, Oscar and Ben, young copywriters living in the next room. Oscar got the big marijuana, got the big marijuana. The girls giggled and nodded. Where did you get that? Betty said. The clerk who brought our bags in asked if they needed anything else. Oscar replied with a smile. Ben bought a portable speaker. The portable speaker was placed on the coffee table. He set up Bluetooth on his cell phone. He lit up the marijuana, took a deep breath, and handed it to Sam. Music played from the speaker. Salam exhaled. Shortly afterward, if Dorian had been, Dorian would be here. With her friends in this room, Dorian was out of line with alcohol. Dorian was out of line with alcohol. Dorian drew the line regarding alcohol and was pretty strict. He didn't like feeling like he wasn't in control of himself. He was giving Betty marijuana, gave Betty some marijuana, gave Betty some marijuana. They chatted and laughed. He was laughing. I was used to being talkative after smoking. Salam tended to keep a low profile. When alcohol was added to the mix, he became more quiet and inebriated. He became more quiet and introverted. She sat in a chair with her eyes half closed, slowly enjoying the music and a nice massage. He was enjoying the music and the soothing massage. The sensations ran all over his body. Ben went to his room, vodka and lemon juice, a bottle of vodka and lemon juice, and came back with disposable cups. Betty made sure Salam drank from the cup. Betty made sure Salam drank from the glass. After the toast, he didn't accept the plastic one. To the pleasant music playing in the room, they began to dance slowly to the pleasant music. That evening, a group of five of us gathered around the communal dining table. They gathered around the dinner table. Oscar was crazy about each other. They were crazy about each other. They never stopped exchanging glances and smiles. It seemed to Betty that they had lost interest in the rest of the group. Betty felt that they had lost interest in the rest of the group. They were in their room getting ready for the beach party. Betty suddenly entered the room. Betty suddenly entered the room. What happened between you two? Betty asked. Nothing, a little embarrassed. It's nice to get a little attention from men. When Dorian's around, no one wants to look at me. When Dorian is around, he scares everyone away. Betty asked skeptically, with doubt. I don't want to seem like a jerk. Salam said he's always tense, even when he pretends to be calm. It makes him tense for a change of scenery, a change of scenery. If he was here, I wouldn't be able to play in the room with you guys. I wouldn't be able to play in the room with you guys, and he wouldn't smoke. He's always serious and careful. He's serious and careful and boring. For example, when we sit in a restaurant, he always sits with his back to the wall and moves around leisurely. He thinks I don't notice him. But he's supposed to be talking to me. He even looks at other customers and pedestrians outside the restaurant. He even looks at other customers and pedestrians outside the store. Today, Oscar has focused all of his attention on me. All of Oscar's attention is focused on me. Secret agents and spies. Betty said sternly, it's not just that Dorian is used to this kind of behavior. There's a fear that someone is watching him. But he's not here now. I'm alone. It really is a relaxing few days. This is my first chance to relax in 2 years. I want to make the most of it. Take care of yourself. In the evening, Salam came to Betty's room again. The simple old man came to Betty's room again. There were muffled voices coming from the beach. Betty was not surprised. Ben and Oscar were sitting by the coffee table. They were holding cups and smoking marijuana. When they saw her, their jaws dropped. She was wearing a short black strappy dress. She was wearing a dress. They were both drunk. They were literally drooling. I could hear them from the bathroom. Betty and Lisa told Oscar that they were offered Salam alcohol and marijuana. Betty and Lisa finally came out, and Ben exchanged knowing glances with them. It was the happiest mood on the island. There was a full moon that night. The festivities on the beach were almost unnecessary. No additional lighting was needed by 10 p.m. At the open bar, Betty's friends were all too drunk. They were in the same boat. Betty's friends felt the same way. Oscar stayed close to Salam. Betty didn't like the way Salam hugged her here and there. Betty didn't like Salam hugging Betty. Betty and Ben tried desperately to do something about Betty and Lisa, but he was always stopped. It was never personal. Ben was stumbling no matter how drunk he was. It didn't matter how drunk he was. Neither Betty nor Lisa thought it was a bad idea that dating a coworker was a bad idea. Near midnight, the DJ started playing melodic techno. He started playing melodic techno. The sensual rhythms warmed up Sandy's dance floor. There was a buzz of excitement on the Sandy's dance floor. Salam slowly moved away from the rest of the group. He walked to the edge of the crowd. The moment he thought anonymous, they drew closer to him. She put her arm around his neck, put his arm around her waist. He put his arm around her waist. He put his arm around her waist, drinking, smoking, and sensual dancing. And one more thing about that night, it was a deadly night for Salam. The estrogen levels in her body had reached a 1-month peak. That night was her biggest failure. The next morning, Salam woke up with a terrible hangover. She had a terrible hangover. Salam was nowhere to be seen. It was like a fog. I couldn't understand. All she could think of was, like a poisoned arrow piercing her temple, the first coherent thought that came to her mind was that the marriage was over. It quickly turned to panic. Shame was beyond her. What have I done? I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I ran to the bathroom. I ran to the toilet, but nothing came out. Thirsty, I drank rusty water from the sink. I drank rusty water straight from the sink. Then I went back to bed, wrapped myself in the sheets, and collapsed. I collapsed wrapped up in the sheets. I cried. After a while, dark thoughts came to me. I ran out to the balcony. I ran out onto the balcony. I couldn't even kill myself. Disappointed, I went back to bed. For hours she lay unmoving. She was in her head, in her head. After all, Dorian, the only way out was to confess everything. She had to confess everything. Dorian would probably never forgive her. Dorian wouldn't trust her. Dorian wouldn't trust her. Dorian doesn't trust her. Dorian himself doesn't trust her. I don't know if I can forgive Dorian's betrayal. Dorian's betrayal under similar circumstances. The answer was no. At breakfast, Oscar and Ben learned that they were no longer welcome at the girls' table. They learned that they were no longer welcome at the girls' table. That afternoon, Betty and Lisa rented a car. Betty and Lisa rented a car and drove to the other side of the island. They went to the other side of the island. They went to see a famous place called Pink Beach. We debated whether we should invite Salama. She didn't come for breakfast or lunch. She didn't show up for breakfast or lunch. I decided I needed to be alone. We picked up 2 young Italian men. The Travelers' Pink Beach Hotel was in a remote location. It was a 30-minute walk to the nearest parking lot. It was a 30-minute walk to the nearest parking lot. The pink sand was not only beautiful to look at, not only did it look good, but it was surprisingly soft. On the way back, we stopped at a vegan restaurant. At the restaurant, we got take-out food. I ordered a takeaway for Salam. I bought some medicine. At first, he didn't open the door. He didn't try to open the door. But he almost broke the door down. I let him in. Hair, swollen red face, tears in his eyes. It seemed he hadn't showered since Betty and the day before. It seemed she hadn't showered either. Betty and Lisa hugged their friend for a long time. They hugged for a long time. They agreed to eat after they showered. Let's take a shower and then eat. I don't want to go to the dining hall with you. I resolutely refused to go to the dining room. I didn't want to hear the whispers. I didn't want to hear the whispers. Salam spent a long and painful night. Salam spent a long and agonizing night. Repeatedly, but never found an answer. How much will I tell Dorian? What will I tell Dorian? It was a one-time mistake. What will I tell Dorian? She is willing to do whatever it takes to right this wrong. After much agony, she's made a difficult decision. If I'm doomed to lose my husband, despite this, she had no choice but to move on with her life. The next day at lunch, Betty and Lisa were surprised. Salam entered the dining room. Salam appeared in the dining room dressed in a flowery, sunny dress. She smiled without looking at the other guests. She didn't even look at the other guests. He attended the last party on the beach. He attended the last party at the beach. He didn't smoke either. I heard a light knock on the door. I opened the door and was surprised. I was surprised to see Oscar standing there. He was standing alone. The next day he closed the door. Betty, Salam, and Lisa stood quietly in the check-in line at the terminal. They stood in line to check in at the terminal. Oscar and Ben stood in line. They didn't stop talking. They seemed to be having a lot of fun. Betty couldn't take it anymore and turned around. She threw Oscar a sharp look and said, "You look so happy when the airplane lands. As soon as the plane lands, you'll disappear. I'm going to torture you to death. If I have his connections, he might let you go." She told Ben, "He'll think you're an accomplice, even if he was waiting for you at the airport. I wouldn't be surprised if he was waiting for you at the airport. I wouldn't be surprised if Dorian was waiting for you at the airport." About Dorian's military career, I didn't know anything about Dorian's military career. He was the biggest man I'd ever seen. Salam called Dorian on the phone. "Betty will give me a ride home. Betty will drive me home." Dorian said, "Betty will drive me home." Dorian soon realized that something was wrong. Because Betty is going to drive me home, Dorian was in the kitchen making dinner. She was in the kitchen making dinner. When Salam entered the house, he dropped everything, and when Salam entered the house, he dropped everything and put his arms around her and kissed her. When she avoided his lips and offered him her cheek, she avoided his lips and offered him her cheek. An hour later, they dined in complete silence. I can't bear it. I've got some bad news. Dorian didn't say anything. Dorian said nothing, repeatedly without hiding. He emphasized that it happened independently of each other. alcoholic couples, and it was a special day in her menstrual cycle, and he apologized to her and said he would do everything he could to would do everything she could to get him to forgive her. Dorian stood up and asked Betty and Lisa. I heard that Betty and Lisa were drinking and smoking together. Did you go to bed with a coworker? You went to bed with a coworker. I ran into the bedroom and started packing my gym bag. I yelled behind me, shut up. He headed towards the front door. She headed for the front door. No, she begged. No, she begged. He put his big hand on her shoulder and easily moved her aside. When he tried to open the door, she clutched at his arm with all her might. Her tears and pain reached him. He froze. Seeing his broad shoulders, she lowered her arm. She almost touched his shoulder. She ran her hands over his trembling body. She hugged him tightly and didn't want to let go. But even if she did, if he decided to come back to me, that meant he wanted to. Just instinctively, not because he reacted instinctively to the sound of his wife's distress. It must have been more than just an instinctive reaction to the sound of his wife's distress. Dorian tried to head toward the motel. He headed toward the motel, but changed his mind and turned back. He needed to listen to Salam from the other side. I didn't want to be alone. Betty showed me the way. Betty confirmed the details of Salam's story. Confirmed Salam's entire story. She added that I turned down the Oscars. I couldn't stop crying for 2 days. At one point, she feared for Salam's safety. I even felt that Salam was in danger. It's not worth pursuing the Oscars. He said he doubted whether he would show up for work on Monday. Dorian sat gloomy for a long time. Dorian got up, went to the guest room, and locked the door. He locked the door. Betty said it was good time to apologize to him or needed time to digest. Time was necessary. At noon the next day, Dorian had not yet left the room or answered the knock. Betty put the tray of food by the door. And said she was going to go check on Salam. I said I would go check on Salam. Salam was in worse shape than 2 days ago. It took Betty a long time to talk her down. It took her a long time to talk her into eating and drinking. Betty dragged her into the bathroom. She closed the bathroom door. Betty collapsed on the floor and began to cry. She burst into tears. Betty was in a terrible situation. There was nothing she could do. Dorian had not yet left the guest room. When Betty returned from work, Dorian had not yet left the guest room. The next day, Betty decided to make dinner with all of Dorian's favorites. She decided to cook dinner. She decided to cook special baked salmon. She smiled. His bedroom door opened, and into the bathroom. When he got to the dinner table, he was almost normal. When he sat down at the dinner table, he was smiled more than usual. After dinner, they sat in the living room, drinking wine and drank wine. Betty said, I'm getting a divorce. She was too hasty at the first opportunity. If you hadn't bought me those pills, I could have been carrying someone else's baby. She made a terrible mistake. She's human. She'll do it again. She will. He who cheats once will cheat always. Do you really believe that? Yes, I do. You don't drink or smoke outside of work. He wouldn't go outside of work. Again, under the same circumstances. Appropriate. Betty tilted her head. He looked at her meaningfully. Everyone deserves a second chance. Betty said it's a second, not a third. Salam has a second chance. I'm going to feed you to the wolves. I've known you for 10 years. I love you very much. Even good people cheat people, do bad things. You don't deserve special treatment. You're wrong. Not just about all of us humans, not just about people, but especially about people. We are all capable of making serious mistakes, whether the situation is going well or not. Why didn't you and Lisa make a mistake? You weren't even married. We couldn't have made that mistake. I had fun, of course, with your coworkers. My money's on Betty, she said, naughty. Give her another chance, at least for a week. If a week goes by and you decide you can't take it anymore, you can go to. But at least for both of you, I love you both. If only you two could stay together. I have an idea. Salam was standing in the kitchen. She was chopping vegetables in the kitchen. Betty had told her. Dorian told her again. That night, the front door opened. I heard the front door open. She turned around warily. Betty was standing there with a nervous expression on her face. As soon as Dorian smiled at her, she dropped what she was doing and jumped on top of him. She wrapped her legs around his waist and covered his entire face with kisses. He tried to avoid it, like avoiding being Licked by a puppy, affectionately. It was a pleasant dinner. Salam didn't feel any discomfort. For the first time in a week, she felt happy and hopeful. That night in bed, she felt happy and hopeful. He politely declined her advances. The head on Roger's shoulder, Roger suddenly stopped moving and looked deeply into his wife's eyes. He looked deeply into his wife's eyes. He pulled a small box out of his pocket. In it lay a diamond necklace. Roger went back to the jewelry store where he had bought that necklace many years ago. Roger went back to the jewelry store where he had bought the necklace many years ago. He traded it for diamond earrings. He traded it for earrings. At this time, he was convinced that he would be able to give them to his wife. Eventually, Tracy found someone to grow old with. She was 52 years old when she married Franklin Jameson. She was 52 years old when she married Franklin Jameson. Franklin was at this stage in his life. Franklin was not special. There is no one special about Franklin. He would never find anyone special, and he loved himself with all his heart. In his most intimate moments, Tracy says that she left her special someone because of her own selfishness and stupidity. She was selfish and stupid. She fell in love with Joey's beauty and youth. She mistook her own desires for love, like a stupid schoolgirl. I was with Roger for 11 years. He did. Even after he found out she was cheating on him, when she found out that he was cheating on her, she thought to herself. She was too focused on the intense pleasure she was getting from lewd sex. She didn't realize that her parents loved Roger as if he were their own child. They tried to make Tracy realize the truth. I tried to make Tracy realize the truth. It took her more than 2 years. The presence of an STD was. Having an STD meant she believed she was in control. The marriage of Roger and his younger cousin Bunny, was a huge blow to Tracy. In particular, it brought them closer together when she found out it was her mother who brought them together. She's part of the family. You forced her to marry my ex-boyfriend. He dumped me. He deserved to be dumped. Mary yelled at her daughter, "If you do this, I will divorce you. Whose side are you on, Mom?" "You're my mother. I raised you well," Mary said quietly. "Even if you are my cousin, didn't Bunny invite me?" said Tracy. "I respect Roger's feelings," said Tracy. "His feelings are more important. Roger's feelings were more important," she said. Bunny and Tracy lived in the same town. When Roger met Tracy, he was polite at best and only glanced at each other. Eventually, Joey settled down and got married. He was no longer the same as he had been before the robbery. At the age of 35, he was maimed by a robber. He became a cripple. His muscular body became dense. He seemed to be losing his influence on women. Joey, when Joey turned 40, he decided to take up with an average woman of average build. The woman seemed to really love him, but even when he went out, the woman didn't look as good as she did a few years ago. The police questioned Roger and Tracy. After Joey was attacked by the robbers took pleasure in hurting Joey. No one told Mary Houston about it. No one questioned Mary Houston about the attack on Joey. Why did the police? The police didn't ask why. Mary's hunch was right. She blamed Tracy. She knew it was all Joey's fault. She knew Roger and Tracy's marriage had broken up. She knew it was Joey's fault that Roger and Tracy's marriage had broken up. She didn't tell Roger or Tracy. Her intentions. I thought they'd agree to subscribe to our channel.
Subscribe to our channel so that your second C, Gaff, doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story. Because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think about listening to the next one.